Back in July 20th, 1969, something extraordinary unfolded. Humans set foot on the moon. It wasn't just a leap for those astronauts. It was a giant leap for humankind. It took years of scientific prowess, engineering feats, and diplomatic maneuvers to make it happen. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. The United States managed to pull off 6 successful moon landings, bringing a total of 12 astronauts to the lunar surface by 1972. But then, it all stopped. Was it because of the danger? Money? Did NASA find something on the moon that it cannot tell the world about? More than 5 decades have passed since a human last wandered on the moon. Despite what many sci-fi tales predicted, we still haven't established a lunar base. In fact, we're not even close to planning a return trip. You'd think that once we cracked the code for getting there, going back would be a piece of cake. After all, history shows us that once we discovered the vast lands between Europe and India, traversing to and fro, the Americas became almost routine. But before we continue, if you are fascinated by the incredible discoveries and spectacular wonders of the universe, be sure to subscribe to The Rocket to continue exploring the cosmos with us. So, why haven't we gone back to the moon? Well, it's not just one simple reason. There are multiple. 1. The Cold War. Back in the day, landing humans on the moon wasn't just about fulfilling a dream. It was also a big part of a cosmic competition between the USA and the Soviet Union. During the 1950s, the Soviets were flexing their space muscles, pouring resources and brain power into their space program. They pulled off some jaw-dropping stunts, like launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, and sending Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet pilot, orbiting around Earth in 1961. By the early 60s, it looked like the Soviets were winning the race to the moon. With the Cold War raging, everyone was on edge. The idea of the Soviets getting a technological upper hand, especially in space, didn't sit well. That's why, in 1962, President Kennedy bluntly stated, "This is, whether we like it or not, a race. Everything we do in space ought to be tied into getting to the moon ahead of the Russians." As former NASA chief historian Roger Launius pointed out, the space race was basically a showdown between the USA and the USSR. Instead of duking it out with tanks and soldiers on Earth, they squared off with scientists and engineers, all aiming to plant their flag on the moon first, kind of like a high-stakes game of capture the flag, but with celestial bodies. But the thing is, times change. Those intense Cold War vibes have faded, and no other country has stepped up to rival the USA in the same way the Soviet Union did. Well, no one except China. And with that intense driving force gone, the urgency to return to the moon has been largely lost too. 2. Politics. Getting to the moon the first time around was no walk in the park. It took over a decade of blood, sweat, and tears, not to mention a boatload of cash. And let's face it, there were plenty of ways things could have gone sideways. Tech glitches, astronaut mishaps, or even a change in leadership pulling the plug on the whole shebang. The fact that it all came together is honestly kind of miraculous. But according to Business Insider, one of the biggest sticking points is that the political hurdles haven't gotten any easier since our lunar vacation. Presidents keep talking about going back, and NASA keeps drawing up plans. But when the price tag starts to skyrocket and the obstacles pile up, those plans often get shuffled aside in favor of more practical goals, like spending trillions of dollars on proxy wars. The thing is, the benefits of revisiting the moon are mostly in the realm of theory. Sure, there's scientific discovery waiting up there, but there's no guaranteed payday. Setting up a lunar base could be handy for refueling, but until there's a clear-cut reason to be shuttling back and forth, or using the moon as a pit stop on our way to bigger cosmic adventures, the whole venture seems like a high-stakes gamble. Simply put, no politician wants their name tied to a pricey flop or a heartbreaking disaster. 3. The first one. was a PR stunt. You know, the story of how John F. Kennedy rallied for the moon landing is often portrayed as this grand gesture of American ambition in the face of Russian dominance in space. But that's not really the truth. Back when Kennedy first stepped into office, he wasn't exactly sold on the idea of a lunar mission. He thought it was too pricey a venture to seriously entertain. Then, cue 1961, a rough year for Kennedy and his administration. The Soviets sent Yuri Gagarin orbiting around the Earth, stealing the spotlight and making the USA seem a bit, well, behind in the space race. To add insult to injury, the Bay of Pigs fiasco went down like a lead balloon. It was a mess, plain and simple, and it made Kennedy look like he was fumbling in the political arena. Understandably, he needed a win, something to shift the narrative away from these mishaps. So, up came the moon mission. Suddenly, Kennedy was painting visions of the USA as a beacon of technological prowess, and himself as a bold, forward-thinking leader. It was a strategic move, a way to regain footing on the global stage and restore faith in his leadership. So, if you're thinking about another lunar expedition, maybe we need another political hiccup to grease the wheels. Just kidding, mostly. 4. It's not efficient. Landing on the moon back in '69, absolutely mind-blowing. And while it makes sense to think that once we cracked that cosmic egg, subsequent missions would be a cakewalk, that's not really the case. After we wrapped up the original Apollo program in '72, we hit pause on our lunar jaunts. Why the hiatus? Well, that's because our initial moon missions were more like a sprint than a marathon. We were in a race against the Soviets, so speed was the name of the game. Efficiency? Not so much. We took shortcuts, didn't bother with long-term planning, and ended up tossing out tons of tech after each mission. Imagine chucking out 2 or 3 jumbo jets worth of gear every time. In a nutshell, our lunar system wasn't built for round trips. It's a wonder we pulled off 17 Apollo missions and 6 lunar landings with that setup. But if we're serious about returning, we need a new game plan. And if I were you, I wouldn't get my hopes up too high. Since Google dangled the $20 million X prize in '07 for the first non-government crew to touch down on the moon, only 3 crafts have made it. And guess what? They were all government projects. No private crews in sight. 5. Better technology is needed. Back in 1969, we achieved an incredible feat by sending astronauts to the moon and bringing them back safely. But have you ever wondered how much technology has progressed since then? Well, when it comes to computers, the difference is mind-blowing. The computers aboard the Apollo lunar modules were incredibly basic compared to what we have today. I mean, the smartphone you carry around is probably around 100,000 times more powerful than those early spacecraft computers. Even some calculators from the 1980s were more advanced. But for everyone going, "We have much better computers now," it doesn't make sense that we're still incapable of going to the moon. You should know that the computers were just one piece of the puzzle. The technology needed for lunar missions had to be super efficient, using minimal electricity. That's why those early computers were intentionally limited in their capabilities. Surprisingly, a lot of the hardware used in the Apollo missions is still considered cutting edge today. It's proof of just how groundbreaking that technology was back then. However, despite these advancements, going back to the moon hasn't been as straightforward as one might think. You see, today's SpaceX launches aren't all that different from those in the 1960s. The lack of significance is still a big challenge for returning to the lunar surface. 6. We're a little traumatized. In the 70s, the Space Shuttle program was seen as a cheaper and safer alternative to landing on the moon again. Sure, it might not have had the same wow factor as a lunar landing, but it played a crucial role in keeping humans in space and maintaining the USA's status as a space exploration powerhouse. Plus, it kept folks excited about what was happening up there. But then came a really tragic moment in 1986, when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded during takeoff. It sent shockwaves across the nation. This meant NASA had to rethink its strategies and scale back the shuttle program. Some missions were even reverted to older, more reliable technologies. And if that wasn't enough, tragedy struck again in 2003 when the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry. PBS details how this disaster prompted President Bush and his administration to seriously question the safety of routine human space travel. Suddenly, the idea of returning to the moon seemed too risky. These incidents really made everyone take a step back and reevaluate the risks involved in space exploration. 7. There's little money in it. In our capitalist society, everything's about the bottom line, right? Well, putting people on the moon doesn't quite fit that bill. It's a huge investment with no immediate returns. In fact, if you tally up the cost of all those fancy gadgets that end up as ocean debris after a mission, it's a big financial loss. But hold on, there are some potential money-making avenues with the moon. Space points out that it's loaded with helium-3, a rare element that could be a game-changer in the energy sector. Plus, imagine using the moon as a pit stop for longer space journeys, like a manned trip to Mars. Stop by, refuel, and increase your chances of reaching your destination in one piece. Sounds promising, right? Well, not quite. To make any of this work, we'd need a proper moon base. Yahoo Finance throws out estimates of around $100 billion just to set up a basic one. And don't forget the annual upkeep, which could run up to $36 billion for a small crew. And that's not even factoring in the costs of mining or refueling operations. So while the idea of turning a profit on the moon sounds enticing, the numbers just don't add up yet. And until they do, the excitement for a lunar return remains somewhat muted. 8. Race for the Arctic. You might wonder why plans to revisit the moon have been shelved for now. Well, it turns out that the resources needed for such a colossal endeavor are in high demand a lot closer to home, in the Arctic to be exact. According to CNBC, climate change is transforming the Arctic from a frozen wasteland into a treasure trove of valuable resources. There's an estimated $35 trillion worth of oil and natural gas lurking beneath the ice, and countries like the USA, Russia, and China are in a heated competition to claim their share. So, instead of pouring all their money and brainpower into a new moon mission, they're focused on this race for Arctic dominance. Interestingly, Wired points out that the challenges of establishing a moon base and staking claims in the Arctic are strikingly similar. In fact, some experts see the Arctic competition as a practice run for the eventual scramble for lunar control. Legal debates are already brewing about how Arctic disputes should be handled, a model that could shape future moon governance. But before we set our sights on the moon, it seems we've got some urgent issues to tackle right here on Earth. 9. It's all about Mars now. You'd think a been there, done that attitude wouldn't fly in politics or science, but surprisingly, it sums up a lot of folks' feelings about the moon. Many in government and space agencies are all about setting their sights on Mars instead. There's even been a bill introduced in the House of Representatives to make Mars NASA's main goal. And it makes sense. Mars offers a wealth of scientific opportunities and captures the public's imagination like no other destination. But it's not all doom and gloom in the world of the moon. Most experts agree we'll need a pit stop on the moon if we want to make it to Mars in one piece. Think of it like a cosmic gas station. Astronauts would refuel and prep there before heading off to the red planet. So, while the moon isn't the main event, it still plays a crucial role in our interplanetary ambitions. In the end, whether we're headed to the moon or Mars, it all comes down to who's willing to pony up the cash and expertise to make it happen. Now, there has been some movement on the moon landing front, with Intuitive Machines' Odyssey lander touching down on the moon back in February. But the question remains: how long until man returns to the moon?